Quebec has announced tough measures for those who refuse to be vaccinated. Premier François Legault says unvaccinated adult Quebecers who do not have a medical exemption will face a significant financial penalty, calling it a healthcare contribution. Now, it doesn't matter if the resident tests negative for COVID-19 and doesn't need medical attention. They will still be forced to pay this health tax. Joining me now to shed some light on whether or not this is constitutional is Stephane Beaulac, a professor at the University of Montreal who specializes in constitutional law. Thanks for speaking with us today, Professor.
My pleasure.
All right, so this is the first of its kind in all of Canada, a financial penalty for not being vaccinated. Does this violate the Canada Health Act?
Well, I mean, it is not taken pursuant to a federal legislation. It is taken on the basis of the Quebec legislation that gives very broad power to the Quebec government in response to the pandemic. I mean, in terms of specificities within the province, we can also highlight that Quebec is the only place in Canada and North America, for that matter, that imposes also a curfew. This time, they're being bold again, in a way, by imposing a COVID-19 tax, in a sense. I'm sure that it'll be coined that way sooner or later, a contribution for those that are unvaccinated. And your question is whether or not it is valid. It is valid in law, under the Constitution, meaning most likely under the Canadian Charter. There's also the Provincial Charter of Rights and Freedoms to take into account. It is really, in the circumstances, the only basis on which it could be challenged. It couldn't be challenged on the basis of legislative authority. Quebec does, like any other province, has the legislative authority to address the pandemic by measures, including curfew, including COVID tax for the non-vaccinated. So it would be, the analysis would bring us under the Canadian Charter and or the Quebec Charter. And, when it is challenged, it is likely to be brought under or tested against the right to equality without discrimination, most likely arguing that it would go against the right to equality, that it discriminates against the people that choose not to be vaccinated. The problem, however, is that be it under the Canadian Charter or the Quebec Charter, discrimination is not prohibited. They are specific grounds of discrimination that are prohibited. And the last time I checked, there was nothing specifically addressing one's vaccination status. In other words, choosing not to get vaccinated is under Canadian and Quebec laws something that is within the realm of freedom, of one's liberty. But that does not mean, however, that if there is a measure that goes against the choice that one has made for oneself, that it would constitute discrimination. Because the basis, to be clear here, basis of discrimination that are prohibited, let's take it under Quebec Charter, Section 10 in particular, addresses prohibited grounds for discrimination, like drawing distinction based on gender identity, on sexual orientation, on race, on color, on sex, on civil status, on language, on ethnic, on national origin. The only thing in that grocery list, if I may say so, of prohibited ground of distinction, of discrimination, that it could perhaps be linked to is political conviction. It couldn't be linked to a handicap because, even interpreting it broadly, that concept of handicap, the contribution would make exceptions for people that have a medical ground for or reason for not being vaccinated. So really, I mean, the only hook, if I may say so, that I can see in the provision of the Quebec Charter that protects against discrimination would be the ground linked to political convictions.
And so,
However,
Professor, would this actually be similar, sorry to interrupt, but would this be similar to, say, a tax on cigarettes or alcohol? Is it similar to that, or does it differ from that?
Yes, well, that's it. I mean, like, short of being able, and just to finish the thought on political convictions, it is very unlikely, in my humble opinion, that the case could be made that choosing not to get vaccinated is a political statement. Even if it is considered with a broad interpretation a political conviction or political statement not to get vaccinated, then the second step in the analysis would kick in. Even if, let's say, and it is a stretch, that it is discriminatory, it is very, very likely to be deemed to be justifiable in a so-called free and democratic society. In other words, the interests of society justifies to impose here a penalty, more or less, for those that choose, even if it is linked, let's assume, to political conviction, political statement of being non-vaccinated. So that's the scheme of analysis under both the Canadian and the Quebec Charter. What is more likely to be the approach to this issue is essentially considering that it is not protected as a human right not to be vaccinated, and that it is really the consequences to be taxed on your decision. It's the consequences of choosing not to get vaccinated.
And Professor,
and this would be, to bring it to your analogy, akin to many other situations where the government decides to tax certain activities and not others, be it extra tax on booze, alcohol, being extra tax for people that choose to smoke, to use tobacco products. And in this case, it would be also akin to that latter activity of smoking, because we all know that the smokers put an extra burden on the healthcare system. And by analogy here, one could say that the tax is justifiable in terms of public policy because it puts an extra burden on the healthcare system, similarly to smokers.
We still have lots to talk about. We'll have to check in with you another time, though, because there's still not a lot of details around this. But we just found this out today that if you are unvaccinated and an adult in Quebec, you could face charges, and a significant penalty is what the Premier said. Professor, thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
That's Stephane Beaulac, a professor at the University of Montreal.